Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and today I'm back with another Jamaica racial group video. So I talked about the brown or the browning class Jamaicans, and then I recently talked about the black Jamaicans, and now today I'm going to talk about the white Jamaicans. So even though this is self-explanatory, who or what are the white Jamaicans? So, white Jamaicans are essentially, in the current sense, the descendants of one or two groups. The main group is that they are the descendants of the settlers who came over once the transatlantic slave trade started and continued. So, we're going to get more into who that was later. And the second group, which is a more minor group, are the recent immigrants who came over to Jamaica post slavery. So those are the two main groups of people who are white Jamaicans. But when you think of white Jamaicans, most people mainly refer to the first group. So essentially, you have to address slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and all of that. And you have to mention the historical context of white Jamaicans and why most of the white Jamaicans currently came from that former group, i.e., descendants of the European settlers. So, going in chronological order, the first group of white Jamaicans, or people who are on the land of what would eventually become Jamaica, are the Spaniards, as there was a period where Spaniards colonized Jamaica from 1509 to 1655, so about 144, 45 years, give or take. So, of course, there are still a lot of grapes, if you know what I mean, happening there, and there still were implementing some African slaves into the country. But overall, the Spaniards didn't last long in Jamaica, or at least compared to other colonies. Again, about 140 years, give or take. And this was because the British came over and took over Jamaica. So once the British took over Jamaica, most of the Spaniards left. They either left to what would eventually become the Hispanic Caribbean. They would either leave to South America, or what would become South America, or what would become Central America, or they went back to Spain. And even during this early Spanish period, few Spaniards actually settled long term in Jamaica. So obviously, when the English took over in 1655, most of the Spanish settlers, where there really weren't much that were settling there long term anyways, fled or were completely expelled from Jamaica. So, due to this, the modern imprint of Jamaica when it comes to the current white Jamaicans, or even the admixture in non white Jamaicans, Spanish isn't really present due to this. So, the British took over colonial Jamaica for about 180 years, give or take, from 1655 to 1834. And the main reason for this was because they wanted to run sugar estates, and Jamaica had the best land, and the slaves there were supposedly the best to run sugar plantations. So it was mainly the English and the Scottish too. Additionally, there were Irish indentured servants that also arrived during this time frame, especially in the 1600s. Though some would blend with the black or mixed race groups, and others would stick with their white groups, essentially. Um, so you have the English and Scottish who were running the plantations, and then you initially had the Irish indentured servants, which were different than outright slaves that the black or the mixed race people were. So those were the three main groups that were in Jamaica pertaining white groups. And if you go on any Jamaican ancestry results, one, two, or at least three of these will show up in the European component, whether they're black Jamaicans, mixed Jamaicans, or just white Jamaicans. Interestingly enough, there's also another group where Sephardic Portuguese Jewish people were fleeing the Inquisition in Iberia, would settle in Kingston and Spanish Town, though they often intermarried with other Europeans, though some assimilated into the broader Jamaican society. It's interesting here that the broader Jamaican society was seen as the black society even then, which makes sense because black Jamaicans were the majority, though most of them married within their race. And a lot of Jamaicans also have Jewish ancestry in their DNA or ancestry results. So this is most likely one of the reasons why. Interesting, I didn't know this part, but there's also a process where, like the Hispanic Caribbean, and I'm sure other places as well, the British brought some Germans in during the 1830s after emancipation to whiten the population and to work on small farms in places like Seaford Town, i.e., Westmoreland Parish. Though obviously that didn't work. And obviously the British colonial period ended in 1834 because emancipation took place. The white Jamaicans made it very clear that they were nothing like the black majority and they didn't really belong there, hence them secluding themselves in their gated communities pre-emancipation and post-emancipation. And it's also why there were very rigid rules when it comes to race mixing, whether through procreation, though obviously there's a lot of graping that was happening, and especially via marriage. So now I want to read into some data regarding the white Jamaican population compared to the overall population of Jamaica going through the colonial era. So regarding Spanish Jamaica, so from 1509 to 1655, the total population overall was very small, with about 2,500 to 3,000 people by the early 1600s as there are very few Tainos left, and most of the residents within this small population were Europeans, i.e., Spaniards, with some Africans. Obviously, the exact percentages aren't available, but historians generally describe the population as predominantly European just before the English conquest. So, at around 1662, so early English rule, and 7 years after the conquest from the Spaniards, there are about 3,653 white and 552 black people were recorded, for a total population of 4,205 during this period in Jamaica, causing for a population that is 86.9% white. Moving on to 1673, there were 7,768 white people and 9,104 black people, causing for a total population of 17,272 people, costing for a population that is 45% white, as the enslaved African population were already a majority at this point, though it wasn't overwhelming. And this was only like 20 years after the English took over. So from 1694 to 1700, the report at this time reported that there are 7,000 white people versus 40,000 black people in 1694, causing for the overall population to be 15% white. And by the turn of the century, i.e., 1700, the total population of Jamaica, or what would become Jamaica, is 47,000 people with 7,000 white people. Again, 15%. From 1787 to 1788, so the late slavery era at this point, the population had a 6.1% white population, with there only being 12,737 white people and a total population of 2,009,617 people. The official return regarding 1788 had 18,347 white people and 9,405 free people of color, so I'm assuming those are mixed people, and 226,432 enslaved people, essentially black people, that exclude the Maroons, causes for a 7.2% white population. So I wanted you all to see the sources just so you wouldn't feel like I'm pulling things out of my ass. So obviously that's the overall Jamaica Wikipedia link. Jamaica Family Search going about the historical background of Jamaica. White Jamaicans, that page. World Atlas, which delves into detail about the ethnic composition of Jamaica historically and currently. Donning the White Mask, I'm guessing this is more detail about white Jamaicans. I'm assuming this is another source, going back to the '08. Jamaican Family Search, I'm pretty sure I spoke about that. The census in Jamaica, so they pulled up actual data. The scholarship, so I guess more details about the population within the late 1800s. And this is more recent census data, but I'll get more into that a bit later. And now we're going to focus on the post-emancipation period from Jamaica up until the 20th century regarding the white Jamaicans. So obviously once emancipation happened in 1834, a bunch of the white population shrank as many of the planters left to go either to their home countries or elsewhere. So, due to this, a very small group remained, though they're usually very wealthy people who are either landowners, merchants, or professionals, which you can definitely see in the influence today, where a lot of the professionals are still white Jamaicans, a lot of the landowners are still white Jamaicans, and a lot of the merchants are still white Jamaicans too, despite them being a huge minority. So there was some intermarriage with the quote unquote Browning mixed race class, which kind of continued the eliteness of the white Jamaicans, and they essentially bred the brownness out of the brown group that intermarried with the white elite. So by the early 20th century, obviously the whites were a very tiny but very elite minority who were still very overrepresented in business, plantations, media, and the colonial administration. So, onto modern white Jamaicans, essentially, in the present day. Today, they make up well under 1% of the population, approximately around 3,000 to 5,000 people in a nation, or in the nation of nearly 3 million people. So, not large numbers whatsoever. When it comes to the descent of these white Jamaicans, many of them obviously descend from the colonial families from before emancipation. So obviously, most of these white Jamaicans are English, Scottish, Irish, Jewish, and German in ancestry and lineage. Of course, there are newer immigrants, i.e., business people, diplomats, retirees from Europe or North America. And despite them being extremely tiny numerically, they're still sometimes prominent in business, tourism, and farming. So I read off some of the data regarding pre-emancipation and I showed all the references and sources. So I'm going to do that for the post-emancipation. I'm just going to read the results there, though it's essentially the same sources and I read the sources for this period anyways. So with 1844, which is the first post-emancipation census, there were 15,766 white people out of the population of 377,433 Jamaicans overall, leading to a 4.2 percentage of a white population. When it comes to the 1871 census, there are 13,101 white people out of 506,154 people total, costing for a 2.6 percentage white population. So it shrunk by almost half in less than 30 years. In the 1960 census, there was 0.7% white people, and by 1970, there are 0.66% white people. I don't know if that's supposed to be less than 1%, but either way, the results were very, very, very short. And by the mid 20th century, outmigration and growth of other groups reduced their white share. So I'm assuming this is where a lot of the. I think this was post indentured servitude, but still, you have more of those communities that came from those communities post indentured servitude, and obviously more black populations migrating into Jamaica. By 2001, the census reports there's a 0.18 percentage of white people, so there's an increase there over the 40 years between then. And then when it comes to the 2011 census era, it essentially reported that 0.16 or 0.16% identified as white, though there's other citations on Wikipedia that shows that the 2% of the population is white, but no matter what sources you use, no matter how you look at it, really, overall, today, the white population is well under 5%, and it's most likely or probably under 1% if using a strict white only identifier or identity. So, whenever a white person who has an obvious Jamaican accent and or they just speak patois, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, you're culturally appropriating, oh, you're putting on, blah, 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 without realizing, no, they're white Jamaicans, and chances are their family's been there for several generations. But people who aren't Jamaican or from the diaspora don't really tend to understand that, and they don't really understand the history behind Jamaica and whiteness. And it's like people tend to forget that Jamaicans also went through colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So, and I think the difference between how Jamaica handled it compared to how the United States handled it explains the difference because the United States has always been a majority white population, even back then, where in Jamaica, it's generally always, with the exception of a few years, has always been a majority black population. And that's because Jamaica was mainly crop land where pretty much they heavily produced stuff and then they ship it off to wherever they shipped it off, which is why there's so many more slaves there compared to the landowners, where the United States, yes, it was a production place as well, but it was also a land place where a lot of the settlers and the slave owners and them, they actively lived there. And a lot of the slaves back then, yes, there was a lot of farm work, but there's a lot of housework as well. So I think that's the difference. And then once slavery ended, a lot more of the white people ended up leaving. So this explains why most people don't think that Jamaica has any white people for correct reasons, but it's incorrect. In fact, if there's none, there is some. They've been there for generations, but they've just been a tiny elite. And due to colonialism, again, the isms come in with the foundation of Jamaica, whether it's racism, colorism, texturism, featureism, and discrimination within the urban planning in Jamaica. That's a can of worms that can go on and on and on and on. And the societal structure heavily is based on this small racial group, as well as the economic structure of Jamaica. So maybe in future videos, I'll go into how they interacted with the other groups of people, but in general, I don't have a whole lot else to say. But this is a quick background when it comes to the white Jamaicans, how they came to be, why there aren't many of them, but they're overrepresented in certain places in Jamaica, but outside of Jamaica, it's almost like they're invisible. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Take care.